Hello, once again, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our virtual classroom. Today we have a relatively long lesson. It's not followed by an actual assignment, but I think it has some really important information that we're going to be using from here on out. So let us go into our notes. And as always, I do recommend that you pause the video as you copy the notes. And if you already have the notes, then we can move forward. And so today we're doing 20-2, which is percents, fractions, and decimals. We are eventually going to get to these numbers. However, as I said in class, you're not responsible for these over the weekend. And unless you're looking at this afterwards, in which case you are responsible for these numbers. All right, so let's first talk about percents. Let's talk about percents. And the word percent can be seen as a compound word where we have the word per followed by the word cent. And per, we know, has to do with ratios. For example, if you had something like $8 per person, that would be $8 per one person. And so in the same way, per cent, we know that cent has to do with 100. That's why whenever with our money, with dollars, 1 cent is one out of 100 that you need to make a dollar. So percent literally means per 100 or out of 100. Percent literally means it's a fraction. It is a ratio where you're comparing to the number 100. So we know that we're dealing with the number 100. For example, when we have 40%, that literally means 40 out of 100. Or 40, a part of 40 that you need out of 100 to make a whole, all right? For example, if you have something like 50%, most of us understand that to mean half. In fact, we see percentages. If your battery on your phone is at 50%, you know that it's at half. If something is 50% off, you know that it is half off. That is because 50% means 50 out of 100. Right? 50% is 50 out of 100, which essentially means half, right? We know that if we were to simplify that, that would be half. But again, what I want you to know is that when you see a percent, that is always out of 100. In this example, we have 8%, which again is just 8 over 100. You can look at a percent as a shorthand version of just writing the whole ratio. 8% is just 8 out of 100. 22% will be 22 out of 100. So in the same way, if you have a number like 13 and you have that over 100, you know that you can write that as 13 per 100 or 13%. Awesome. So moving on. So, obviously, to make a percent into a fraction is super simple. You just take the number, the percent, and you put it over 100. However, by now you should realize that the only thing missing there is that we want to make sure those fractions are simplified. So while yes, to write 40% as a fraction, all I need to do is put it over 100. Really, to get the simplest version of that fraction, I need to make sure that I simplify. I divide this. I can divide it by 20. And divide the denominator by 20 as well, giving me the fraction of 2/5. Now listen carefully to me, ladies and gentlemen, as I say this. 2/5 is exactly the same thing as 40%. If you had a pizza and somebody gave you 2/5 of the pizza, that is as if they're giving you 40% of the pizza. It is the exact same thing. If somebody gives you 40% of something, they're giving you 2/5 of that something. All right, so again, to make a percent into a fraction, we just simply put the percent over 100 and we simplify. Now, to go from a fraction to a decimal, ladies and gentlemen, it is very simple. You guys should know how to do this already. We need to remember that a fraction simply means that we're dividing the numerator by the denominator, right? This means division. Fraction simply means division. So 2 divided by 5, if I work that out, remember, first number goes inside, 2 divided into 5. 5 cannot go into 2. So I put a decimal, but 5 can go into 20 exactly 4 times. 5 times 4 is 20. Therefore, 2/5 is the same thing as 4/10 or 40 hundredths. It's the exact same thing. So 40% is 2/5, which is 40 hundredths or 4/10. 4/10 is 40%. So ladies and gentlemen, what I want you to get from this is that percents, fractions, and decimals are really three different ways of writing the same thing. There really is not a difference. It's just from a different perspective. All right. A percent is relating as a ratio between that number and 100. A fraction is just a simplified version of that ratio. And a decimal is the decimal equivalent of those, which is in some ways it's out of 10 or out of 100 out of 1,000, depending on the decimal. It's just a different way of writing the same thing. Same thing with 8%. 8%, to make that into a fraction, would be 8 out of 100. And if I simplify that, I can divide both of these by 4. That would be 2/25. So 2/25 is the simplest version of 8%, 8 over 100. Now, to make that into a decimal, I simply have to divide 2 by 25. 25 cannot go into 2, so I put a decimal. 25 still doesn't fit into 20, it's too large. So I put another decimal, another 0. And 25 goes into 200 exactly 8 times. 25 times 8 is 200. Ladies and gentlemen, 8% is the same thing as 2 over 25, which is the same thing as 8 hundredths. If there's any doubt that 2/25 is the same thing as 8 over 100, notice that when I divided 2 by 25, it gave me 8 hundredths. And if I divide 8 by 100, let's see what I get. 100 cannot fit into 8. It cannot fit into 80 either, but it does fit into 800 exactly 8 times. Notice, ladies and gentlemen, that I get the exact same answer. 8 hundredths is the same thing as 8%. 22%. 22% is the same thing as 22 hundredths. I can divide both of these by 2, which gives me 11 fiftieths. Now, again, how do I change a fraction to a decimal? You simply divide. So I take 11 and I divide it into 50. 50 cannot go into 1. It cannot go into 11, but 50 does fit into 110. It fits twice. So I put a decimal, 2. That would give me 100, and I get a remainder of 10. Let's keep going, bring down the 0. 50 goes into 100 exactly 2 times. 50 times 2 is 100. 100. And so my answer would be 22 hundredths. So again, percent to fraction, percent is over 100, I simplify it. Fraction to decimal, all I have to do is divide. But what if I want to go straight from a percent to a decimal without turning it into a fraction? Do you all see a pattern between the percent and the decimal? Between the percent and the decimal. Like 40%, 40 hundredths, 8%, 8 hundredths, 22%, 22 hundredths, hundreds. Notice that there's a hundredth in each one of those. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, there is a pattern that this is a shortcut that you can follow to go from a percent to a decimal and from a decimal back to a percent. In fact, to change a percent into a decimal, all you have to do, ladies and gentlemen, is remember that there is a decimal right here next to the percent and move the decimal over 1 2 times. So again, here we have 40%, which is the same thing as 40.0%. And I can take that decimal and move it to the right 1 2 times, making this 40 hundredths. That's what I have right here. The decimal's not in front of the 4. It is 40 hundredths. Now, if I want to make this decimal back into a percent, I can move the decimal to the right twice and put a percent symbol there. Now it is 40%. Now, an easy way to remember where to move the decimal when you have a percent, ladies and gentlemen, just think of it this way. Think of the decimal not liking the percent, okay? The percent and the decimal don't get along. And so in order to get rid of the percent, the decimal will move 1 2 spaces away from the percent, leaving me just the decimal, 40 hundredths. Now, if I want to go back into a percent, then I can take that decimal and move it to the right twice and put a percent symbol, so that is 40%. Very simple. It is very simple, though it is easy to forget because it is so simple. But again, let's do the same thing for 8%. 8% does have a decimal right there. To make that into a decimal, remember we want to get rid of the percent, so the decimal will move 2 spaces, 1, 2 away from the percent, leaving me with 8 hundredths. And again, if I want to make the decimal back into a percent, we just move the decimal 1, 2 spots to the right, and we put the percent symbol, so that would be 8% again. Now, this is possible for any decimal, ladies and gentlemen. If you have any decimal amount, like let's say you had 125 thousandths and you wanted to make this into a percent, well, let's move it 2 times to the right, 1, 2, so that would give me 12 and 12.5%. And if I wanted to make that once again into just a decimal without the percent, I would move it 2 times away from the percent, leaving me with 125 thousandths once again. All right. Same thing with 22%. To make 22% into a decimal, move the decimal 2 times away from the percent, leaving me with 22 hundredths. And then from 22 hundredths to make it back into a percent, I move it 2 times to the right, leaving me again with 22%. Pretty simple. All right, so again, ladies and gentlemen, we saw how to make a percent into a fraction. I simply remember a percent is over 100 and I simplify. I saw how to make a fraction into a decimal. So I take that fraction and I divide the numerator by the denominator. That leaves me with a decimal. And I even saw how to make a percent into a decimal without making it into a fraction. I simply move the decimal 2 times away from the percent sign. And to make a decimal back into a percent, I simply move the decimal 2 times to the right, and that leaves me again with the percent. However, how can I go back from my decimal back into a fraction? So again, a fraction into a decimal, you divide. But how do you do a decimal back to a fraction? Well, for that, let's go into the second part of our notes. And so once again, ladies and gentlemen, we know how to make a fraction into a decimal. We just divide. So again, this was 40%. And to make 40% into a fraction, I put 40%, so for 40 over 100. Remember, these are the same thing. And I simply simplified it, and that gave me 2/5. All right. Now, to make 2/5 into a decimal, I divided 2 by 5. 2 divided by 5, and that gave me 4/10 or 40 hundredths. 0.40, either way. Now, here, ladies and gentlemen, is something that could seem a little confusing, but it really makes tons of sense. Now that I have a decimal, to make this back into a fraction, let's ask ourselves, how do I say this decimal? What is the correct way to say 0.40? Now, if you remember from elementary school, to name a decimal, I have to look at the last place value, the last digit, and see what place value is that. And here I can see that this is in the hundredths place, the hundredths place. In fact, this is 40 hundredths. So what I'm going to do, ladies and gentlemen, is simply write that. I'm going to write 40 hundredths. And there is my fraction. It's 40 hundredths, so it's 40 out of 100. 40 out of 100, that's 40%. Isn't that what I started with? 40%, what I have over here. And if I simplify that, notice how I'm back at 2/5. Again, to go from a decimal to a fraction, you just have to read it the right way. This is 40 hundredths, 40 hundredths. That's it, 40 out of 100. It is a fraction. If I simplify it, I am back to 2/5. 2/5. Now, what if you say, well, Mr. Lugo, what if you leave it at 4/10? Well, read it. 4/10, isn't that 4 out of 10? 4/10. Simplify it. Once again, we're back to 2/5. So again, do we take the fraction? We divide to make it into a decimal. We get 40 hundredths. And then to make it back into a fraction, 40 hundredths, I simply wrote down 40 out of 100, and I simplified to make it back to 2/5. 4/10 is 4 out of 10. We simplify, we're back to 2/5. It's that simple. Let's do another one. What if we start with 2/25, which you will remember 2/25 was the same thing as 8%, I believe. Yeah. So we had 8%, which again, 8% is the same thing as 8 per 100. They're the exact same thing. 8% is the same thing as 8 over 100. 8 over 100 is 8%. If I simplify that, that left me with 2 over 25. So again, to make into a decimal, I simply have to divide 2 divided by 25. So 2 divided by 25 gave me 8 hundredths. 8 hundredths. 800, 8 over 100. So it's 8 over 100, which if you will remember, anything over 100 is 8%. 8%, which again is what I started with. And if I simplify it, once again, ladies and gentlemen, I find myself at 2/25. It's the exact same thing. Let's try one more. What about 11/50ths, which you will remember 11/50ths, what's the simplified version of 22 over 100, which 22 over 100 is 22 per 100 or 22%, right? So if we divide 11 by 50, we get 22 hundredths, 0.22, 22 hundredths. 22 hundredths, so I'm going to write 22 hundredths, which when I simplify leaves me once again with 11/50ths. Ladies and gentlemen, it is very simple to go from one to the other, all right? Remember, a percent is always over 100. That's the fraction. 22% is simply 22 over 100, which I can simplify to 11/50ths. Anytime you see a fraction, you should know by now that a fraction simply means division. So 11 divided by 50, that left me with 0 and 22 hundredths. And to make it back into a fraction, 22 hundredths is 22 over 100, 22 hundredths. And I can simplify that back to 11/50ths. Ladies and gentlemen, as far as the notes, I'm going to leave it at that right now. There was no assignment for this, not yet at least, but I hope that this was helpful. I hope that you found it insightful. And with that in mind, I will see you next time.